Okay. So we're very pleased to have Professor Dominique Lamy with us today in our seminar. Professor Lamy has a BA in Mathematics and Philosophy and an MBA. She also has a BA in Psychology and an MA and PhD in Cognitive Psychology that she completed in Tel Aviv University. She already started to investigate attention during her doctoral studies, which she did under the supervision of Professor Joshua Tzal. She then continued to a postdoc at Johns Hopkins she then continued to do her postdoc at Johns Hopkins under the supervision of, or at the lab of, Professor Howard Egath's lab. After that, she joined the Tel Aviv Psychology Department, now known as the School of Psychology in Tel Aviv University, and is now staff and a professor there. She holds multiple roles at the School of Psychology. She participated in many scientific meetings. She published many papers in scientific journals, high-end scientific journals. Her research is about attention and about emotion. She has many successful PhD students who have now continued to be staff at different universities. She is a reviewer and an editor in a few journals. And we're very pleased to have you today with us, Dominique, to tell us about your research. So welcome to our seminar.
Very much. Thanks. So I will start by sharing my screen. Here we go. Okay, so hello everybody. Thanks again, Sharon, to invite me in this wonderful seminar. What I want to do today is actually not talk about my very past research on attention and on conscious and unconscious processing, but tell you about things that we're doing right now in the lab. And my objective here is more to get your insights about what we're doing, because it's pretty new and we really are at the beginning of this investigation. So I will give you quite a lengthy background on how we arrived at these questions. And then, of course, I will show you a number of studies from the lab. So let's see if it's working. So we spent a lot of time searching our environment. And that's what could be a 15th century version of Where's Waldo. So if I ask you to look for this camel here, it might take you some time to find it. And your attention might be captured by more salient items like this red tent here before you land on the camel. And a lot of researchers have expended a lot of efforts to understand what kind of factors guide our attention. And we have learned a lot about this topic. So we know that we can direct our attention on a location that we know to be relevant. We know that salient objects are more likely to capture our attention, but that we can override this capture if we have specific goals in mind. And we also know that we can learn to suppress stimuli that we know to be irrelevant over time. And also that memory plays an important role in how we deploy our attention. And all these sources of guidance have been modeled in a number of box models that you can see here. So we have the old models by Wolf and by Treisman. And as time has passed, these models have become increasingly complex. And these are newer models. This is a very interesting paper by Luck and colleagues who tried to settle their disagreements with the most salient contenders in the field of attentional guidance and attentional capture. So you had Teves and Folk and Gaspalin and Luck himself, and they tried to model how attentional priority is determined. And you have also a model by Wolf, which is also taking into account a lot of different sources. So if we started out with bottom-up and top-down factors as the primary determinants of attention, you'll see that new factors have emerged, and there's a complex interaction between these factors to determine what location in our visual field is going to get the first shift of attention. So this is basically the question we're going to dwell on in this talk. How do we determine where and when our attention goes to the most prioritized location in the visual field? So what these models have in common is that they all hypothesize that there is a master map or a priority map on which all the signals for guidance converge. And the most activated location, so the activation which is going to benefit from most factors of guidance, is going to get the first shift of attention. I think I'll close the window because it's pretty noisy. Now, the difference between the models is basically on the weights that they assign to each of the factors we've discussed. So some models will give a high weight to feature enhancement, and others will give a high weight to selection history, etc. But they all make the same assumption that at every given moment, the location with the highest activity, the highest activation, is going to be the first location to get our attention. And this entails, since we live in a dynamic world, this means that at every moment, my attention is going to be yoked to the location that has the highest priority. So it looks like we have basically not so much control about where our attention will go, because whenever something changes in our environment and the ranking of priorities is going to change, I'm going to have to assign my attention automatically to the highest priority location. Now, this is a little bit surprising because we know on the other hand, that temporal information plays an important role in the allocation of our attention. So the work of Kian Nobre, for instance, showed that if we know in advance that the relevant event for our task is going to occur in, say, half a second, then every event that's going to occur at the expected time is going to get a boost of attention. So we can deploy our attention not only in space according to the highest priority, but also in time. And so what I'm going to try to understand here is how we can combine these two domains of knowledge. So on the one hand, we have most models of attentional guidance, according to which at any given moment, you automatically deploy your attention to the highest priority location. But on the other hand, temporal attention can help you. And in order to explain the tension that can exist between these two domains, let's look at the spatial cueing paradigm. So the spatial cueing paradigm is one of the most popular paradigms in order to study the allocation of attention. And so in this example here, subjects are looking for the red item. Let's say here, this red E, and they have to respond as to whether the red item is E or H as fast as possible. And a few moments before the search display appears, a cue appears. So the cue here is this 4 red dots. Now, according to Folk's contingent capture theory, when I look for a red item, any red item is going to capture my attention. And so in this paradigm, the evidence for capture of attention would be that I'm faster to respond to this E when it occurs at the same location at the cue than when it occurs at a different location. So in this case, if reaction times are faster, and this is called the cue validity effect, the conclusion would be that the cue captured attention to its location. And the reason for that is that at the moment when the cue appeared, it was the highest priority location. So beyond our control, we allocated our attention to the cue. And this is going to explain why when the target appears at the same location, I'm going to be fastest to react to it, because it is at the locus of my attention. Now, this finding was replicated a very large number of times, but it's surprising because in these experiments, the sequence of event is really predictable. So we know that a cue that is completely unpredictable as to where the target happens is going to occur on every trial. We know how the search display looks. And so it is surprising that we don't wait for this time, and we don't wait to see this kind of display in order to deploy our attention. So this is the basic question I'm going to try to ask here. And the truth is, we stumbled on this question because we encountered a number of findings that were difficult to accommodate in current models of attention. So again, to summarize what I said so far, current models of attention do not take into account when attention is allocated in the visual field. The idea is that whenever something has this highest priority, we're going to deploy our attention to it. But on the other hand, temporal attention can guide our attention. And what we want to know is how the two can be combined within the same type of model. Okay, questions so far? Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is first tell you about those findings that we found difficult to accommodate. And then I'm going to present a tentative model that, that explains these findings. And since this model was built completely post hoc based on findings that did not actually aim at understanding when attention is deployed in time, I will present the results from 3 studies that test novel predictions of the model. Okay. So what findings did we find difficult to explain? One of the questions that has kept us busy in the field of attentional capture is whether there are some types of stimuli that have the ability to capture our attention automatically and mandatorily. And one of the most prominent candidates in terms of stimuli is the abrupt onset. So the idea is that when a new object appears in our visual field, we automatically deploy attention to this stimulus, because since it was not there before, it might have a significance for our survival. And there have been a very a large number of studies arguing about whether abrupt onsets have this special ability to capture attention. And in a semi-low experiment, Chip Folk showed that what determines where our attention goes is our search goals. So if we return to this task here, if I'm looking for a red item, an object that is completely irrelevant to the task, that occurs at an irrelevant moment and at a location that is totally unpredictable at the target location, is going to capture my attention. That is, it's going to yield Q validity effects. But a salient object, which is an abrupt onset, as you see here, those 4 dots that are the only object appearing here around these boxes in the visual field, is not going to capture my attention. And so the, as you can see here, the color stimulus captured attention, but the onset stimulus did not capture attention. There is no Q validity effect. And so from these kind of findings, Folk drew 2 implications. The first was that our search goals are basically the main source of guidance of attention. And the second conclusion was that, surprisingly, even the strongest possible stimulus, which is abrupt onset, do not capture our attention automatically. So in the field of attentional capture, there has been a kind of pendulum. So first, we thought that bottom-up stimuli were the most potent in capturing attention. And then most of the field went to believe that top-down control is much more significant in the allocation of our attention. And then recently, a study by Gaspalin and colleagues soon overturned the conclusion by Folk that abrupt onsets do not capture our attention automatically, in the research I want to show you here. So what they found is that whether or not we're going to find Q-validity effects, which are supposed to index attentional capture, depends on how difficult our search is. So here in these two types of trials, you're looking for the red target. In one case, the task is easy because the distractors are very different from the target. And in another case, the task is difficult because the distractors are very similar to the target. And in both cases, a cue appears, an abrupt onset. And what is again measured is the cue validity effect. What Gaspalin showed is that when the search is difficult, you get a very large and reliable cue validity effect. Whereas when the search is easy, you get none at all. Now, this finding is surprising because before you even know whether your search is going to be difficult or not, the cue appears. And so if it captures attention, it must have captured attentions in both cases. And so why is that you find no cue validity effect in the easy search, but you find a huge one in the difficult search? So the way Gaspalin and colleagues explained this finding is by saying that basically this cue validity effect mainly indexes how long it takes to disengage our attention from a distractor. So what happens in both cases is that attention is captured by the cue. It remains at its location until the search display appears. And then I'm going to have to decide whether this object here that is under my spotlight is or isn't the target. And when it isn't the target, and it's very similar to the target, this decision is going to take time. Whereas when it's very different from the target, I'm going to be able to disengage very quickly. And so this time here mainly indexed the difficulty to disengage. And so there's something a little bit troubling about this explanation, because as we know from very old research by Posner, when we deploy our attention in space, there are a few components that are likely to be time consuming. We have to disengage our attention from the present locus, and then we have to move our attention and then engage our attention in a new object. And moving our attention takes time. And so in order to accommodate these findings within the framework that Gaspalin suggested, which he called the dwelling hypothesis, and which assumes that basically it may take no time at all to move our attention, we have trouble accommodating all kinds of findings showing that it takes time to move our attention from one location to the other. So this was the first puzzling finding that we had trouble explaining.
Dominique,
now, yeah.
Is it, can I ask a question?
Of course, definitely.
I want to ask, I mean, I understand that I'm not that an expert in attention, but I understand that the attention is kept at the location of the cue as long as the actual search array doesn't appear. And when you realize that it's not the target, then you have to change your attention, the location to another. Now I'm thinking that in the easy search, you have, even though your vision at the periphery or at the other locations is not good enough, is not of high resolution, so you can't determine that when you're actually attending the H, still the colors are so different, so that may give you a very easy, you have peripheral information that you can use to make the correct decision directly, whereas when all the colors are basically the same, in the difficult one, just on average, you may jump to the correct location, but on average, you will have to pass 2 locations in order to reach the correct one.
Right. This is an excellent question. That's the reason why the task requires you to discriminate between an E and an H, which are relatively, so if the color is indeed salient, the shape is not salient. And so these tasks are designed so that you will require focused attention in order to perform the task. Yeah. And these stimuli are at 5 degrees of visual angle in the periphery. So you don't have that good of an information visually. And so absolutely, if your task was much easier in terms of the response feature, you would not need attention to get there. And so we would not be exploring attentional motion, basically. You're right.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
So,
you. Yeah, thanks.
okay, so another puzzling finding from the same experiment, from the same series of experiments that we replicated a number of times, is that if you look here, when your cue is valid, that is when the cue appears at the location of the target, you're much faster to respond when the task is easy than when the task is difficult. So even on valid cue trials, it's much faster to respond when the search, when basically when your distractors are dissimilar than when your distractors are similar. So of course, there are trivial explanations to this finding. One is that, well, sometimes your cue does not capture our attention. And so if you have no guidance here at all, it's obviously going to take you more time to find the target when the search is difficult than when it's easy. And also, once you got to the target location, you might be tempted to verify whether it is your target or not. And this verification process is going to be easier when the distractors are very dissimilar from the target than when they are similar. But these two accounts for this finding do not hold for the trials that are fastest. When I'm really fast to respond, it means that, well, the cue captured my attention and I happened to be at the right location when it captured my attention, so I could answer fast. And I didn't bother checking whether I was at the correct location. So in order to see whether indeed the two explanations that I gave earlier could explain this weird finding of much faster reactions. And when I say much faster, it's like 150 milliseconds faster when the search is easy than when the search is difficult for valid cue trials. We looked at this distribution of reaction times. So what you see here is the reaction time. And here you have the mean reaction time for the 10% fastest trials, and then you go up to the 20% fastest trials, and so on. So what you have at the basis here of these curves for the quantile, the first quantile, is basically the 10% fastest trials for these three conditions: easy, difficult, or a mixed difficulty. And what you see is that even for the very fastest trial, there is a huge difference whether my search is easy or difficult. And this is difficult to understand. If we assume that this comes from trials in which my attention was not captured, it means that this cue here, which yields very large cueing effects, captured my attention less than 10% of the trials, which is improbable. Okay, so this is the second finding that we found difficult to explain. Is that clear? Do you have questions here? Okay. A third finding comes from a paper that we published last year, and this experiment was run for entirely other reasons. But what we had here is that instead of presenting only one cue before the target, we presented two successive cues, and these cues were again completely unpredictable with regard to the target location. What we found is that we got cue validity effects at the location of both the first cue and the second cue. Now, if our attention was moving like a spotlight and it was first captured by the first cue and then it moved to the second cue, there's no reason to expect that facilitation should be observed at the location of the first cue. And we ran a number of control experiments to show that the effect of facilitation at the location of the first cue did not result from those trials in which the first cue did not capture it, the second cue did not capture attention. So we had evidence that both cues captured attention, and still we had facilitation at both locations. This is difficult to explain because most models of attention suggest that we cannot split our attention between two different locations. And another finding, which is also difficult to explain, that came from the same study but was replicated in different contexts, is that even when the first cue, one cue, was presented close to half a second before the search display, we got cue validity effects. What you see here is the cue validity effects. You have a 50 millisecond cue validity effect. When you have half a second to realize that this was not my target and that I could either redistribute my attention across the whole visual field or return to the center. But it's very puzzling that we remain half a second at the same location that we know to be irrelevant before the search display occurs. Okay, so we had quite a bunch of weird findings. And we tried to find a model that could accommodate all these findings. And if you think about it for a minute, what all these findings have in common, or what the difficulty to interpret them has in common, is that they all assume that if we find a spatial cueing effect or cue validity effect, it means that attention was captured by the cue at the moment when the cue appeared. Okay, so it means that at a certain moment, the most salient object was the cue, therefore attention was directed to it, and then it remained focused on that location until the search display occurred, and then we could have a snapshot of where the attention was by calculating the cue validity effect. Now, if you have an alternative account according to which you don't allocate your attention at every moment, but you actually summate the activation that occurs across a whole attentional episode. But what you do is wait for the right context to occur and then deploy your attention to the highest accumulated activation location. So we call this model the priority accumulation model, which is basically a framework more than a model, and it's very tentative. It shares a lot of hypotheses, assumptions with other models. So it stipulates that a variety of factors determine how much activation accrues to any location in the visual field. So how salient an object is, whether it matches our goals, our task goals, if there's noise, etc., and that the winner will get the first attentional shift. And the larger the advantage of the winner over its competitors, the more time it's going to, the less time it's going to take to resolve the competition. But the model makes two new hypotheses. The first is that we don't have a freeze at every moment as to which location has the highest priority, but priority accumulates until a context that signals that this is the right moment to deploy your attention occurs. So we have an assumption of a hypothesis that activation accumulates, and the hypothesis that we need a context to trigger the deployment of attention. So as I said, so far, we tried to explain the previous findings using this model. And in order to explain how this model can explain these findings, I'm going to give you a small illustration, a short illustration of how the model works for in all kinds of situations. So I'm going to, for this example, I'm going to rely on a tag that I will use in two experiments in the new findings I'm going to show. So in this experiment, we're looking for the perfect circle. And the task is to respond where the small dot here appears, on the left or on the right. And what I'm showing you here is 3 different levels of competition. So in the low competition condition, the distractors are very different from the target. And so it's going to be very easy to find the target. In the mixed condition, we have 1 distractor that's pretty similar to the target and 2 that are very different. So we have medium competition here. And in the most difficult search, all distractors are similar to the target. So if we have a, so if we want to calculate the weights that are accruing to each of these locations, what I'm showing here is arbitrary weights that, that reflect the competition in a given display. So I'm starting with the old difficult condition. So the target is of course the most similar to what I'm looking for. So it gets 10 points. And because the distractors are very similar, they're just slightly less activated. And because there is noise, identical distractors can get slightly different weights. Now, before that, we have a cue, and this cue is completely irrelevant to the task. It's an abrupt onset. It doesn't have the target defining feature, and so it's going to get a small weight here. Now, according to PAF, when I'm going to deploy my attention in a search display, I'm going to do that based on the accumulated weights at each location. So in this case, the difficult distractor here, which gets the cue, is going to be the most activated location and is going to win the competition. And so it's going to take me a long time to respond to the target, because I'm going to have to analyze this distractor, disengage my attention to it, move to the target, and we're going to get a large queuing effect, which is exactly what Gaspalin obtained in his experiments, and we replicated it. Now, in the all easy condition, now the distractors are going to have very small weights, and the target is going to win the competition both when a distractor is queued and when the target itself is queued. So it's going to win by far in both cases. 10 versus 5 points, 13 versus 3 points. What it means is that the queue makes a very small difference in this situation. And this explains why we find no queuing effect in this situation. Okay, now the most interesting case is what happens with medium competition. With medium competition here, for instance, so we have this distractor here, which is quite activated, and it has a weight that's quite similar to the targets. And we have different distractors. And so the summed activation will look like this. Now, in this case, the target is going to be the most activated location, irrespective of whether it is queued or not. But when it is not queued, it's going to win by just a little bit, and it's going to take time to resolve the competition. Whereas when it is valid, when the queue is valid, it's going to take less time to resolve the competition. And what it means is that we're going to get a small queuing effect, although at no point in time the queue captured attention. Okay, in both cases, the first shift of attention is going to go to the target, but because it's going to suffer less competition when it's validly queued than when it's invalidly queued, we're going to get a small queuing effect. Okay, and this explains all the findings that I have reviewed for you. So it explains why, I just explained why it explains why attentional shifts can take no time. It is not that an attentional shift takes no time. There was no attentional shift to start with. Okay, when the search is really easy, the queue does not weigh in the competition at all. I also explained why, when the queue is valid, reaction times are going to be much faster the easier the task is. And this is because even when the queue is valid, the target is going to compete with all the locations. And so the more difficult the competition, the more time it's going to take, even if the queue is valid. It also explained why we can find two validity effects at two different locations, because the competition is resolved in the search display. And so since we accumulated the activation at the first location and then at the second location, they're both going to compete with the target and therefore yield queuing effect.
Dominique,
and finally,
can I ask?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, Rafi.
I wonder if the timing of the shift of attention is induced by the predictability, temporal predictability of the experiment, or because the visual stimulus suddenly appears on the screen and you know, now it's time to shift the attention?
That's a wonderful question. That's exactly going to be the question we're going to ask in our third study. So this is exactly what I'm going to look for. Try to characterize what makes a context. Thank you.
Dominique, I have a question. Just maybe
Yeah.
I missed something in the search task. What happened to the presentation? Is it disappear or still presented until the answer?
Okay, we have experiment with both. Sometimes it's until response, or 1 second and a half, or until response. And in other studies, we used accuracy as our dependent measure. And so the displays appeared for 85 milliseconds. I will present a study showing that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other question? No? Okay, so the last thing I wanted to say, it also explains why we find Q validity effects even when we have half a second to disengage from the queue. And again, because we never went there in the first place, we haven't been waiting for half a second. Okay, so as I said, all these explanations are completely post hoc. And so we try to see whether, well, we can have new predictions and see if they can, we can validate or invalidate the model. So in the first study, what we looked at is we wanted to see, to seek more direct evidence that our attention is deployed in the search display. That is when the appropriate moment for deploying your attention has arrived, and not in the queue display. And in order to do that, we used, we measured eye movements. So this study was conducted by two of my students, Daniel Toledano and Mo Sassi. And we used exactly the task that I told you about a minute ago. So we had a queue that was not predictable. And then we had a task that was easy, mixed difficulty, and all difficult. And the task was exactly the same. That is, what subjects had to do is to do a manual response, but they were free to move their eyes. And the idea here is that if they're free to move their eyes and they don't have to refrain from making an eye movement to whatever catches their attention, then if the cue captured their attention, the eye movement should be locked to the cue onset. And if they wait for the search display, the eye movements should be mostly locked to the search display. So we had three main predictions. So as I said, if path is correct, most first saccades should be locked to the search display. Now, most search saccades, first saccades, it's not a very clear prediction. What is most first saccades? Would 60% be enough? 70%? Also, obviously, path does not posit that we are never, ever making an eye movement, or our attention is never wrong in taking the context into account. So on some trials, of course, attention will be allocated to the cue at the moment of the cue. So the question of the proportion here makes it a little bit difficult to rely on this prediction exclusively. So we had to move on to additional predictions. The additional prediction is that even if I did not make a saccade that is locked to the cue should have an effect on my late saccades. So suppose I make a late saccade that takes into account the search display. If path is correct and we really allocate our attention as a function of the accumulated priority, we should find an effect of the cue on where my eye gaze lands in the search display. Now here also, there is a caveat, because maybe sometimes the cue captures my attention, but it takes me time to make the saccade. So what could look like a saccade that is influenced by the search display may be basically a late first saccade that is completely locked to the cue. So this is why we need the third prediction, which is that this cue influence in where I'm going to direct my gaze should be influenced by how difficult the search is, because we said that the more difficult the search, the higher the relative weight of the cue in deciding where I'm going to allocate my attention. And if the search display configuration has an effect of where my eyes land, then I can be entirely sure that it's not simply a reaction to the cue. It is a deployment of the gaze of my eyes that has to do with the search display as well. Okay, is that clear? Because this is going to be important to understand the results. Are these questions about these predictions? Okay.
Yeah,
I've got one.
Yeah.
Oh.
Josh?
Okay, so it's just kind of strange that you're focusing on the first saccade. Shouldn't it be the last? Shouldn't performance correlate with the last saccade to the target if they need their attention?
Right. The idea is that if I look at the last saccades, then I'm going to have, I'm looking at the redeployment of attention. What I want to know is that this priority map, this master map of locations, as Trisman used to call it, this is where we have the activations calculated. So my first saccade is going to be at the most activated location, and sometimes I'm going to be wrong. And I want to grasp these cases in which I'm wrong. So if I go to the queue, I'm wrong, because on 75% of the tries, it's not going to be the target location. And so if I look only at where I went eventually, then I'm always going to land on the saccade, on the target, obviously. So what we really are looking at is not what explains performance, but what is the highest priority location. And the assumption which you could discuss is that the first saccade is going to go to the highest priority location. Does it answer your question, Josh?
Yeah, I got it perfectly. I was just interested in what explained performance, but that's a separate issue. I agree.
Okay. Okay.
Can I also ask a question? I want to ask if you found, during the preparation to make a saccade, when you realize that you are not on the target, do you find any other characteristics of eye movements that could predict where the actual saccade will go, or?
Actually, the results were so clear with just plain saccades that we did not go into I mean, we made 100 different analyses, but it just made the story more complicated without added benefit. So we looked at dwelling time and all kinds of stuff, but basically, as I hope you'll be convinced, the results were pretty clear in terms of the exact predictions. So of course, there are a lot of things that we could explore with this paradigm, but we were interested in a very specific question. When do we deploy our attention? Okay. So 0 here denotes the cue display onset, and then it was on the screen for 100 milliseconds and then disappeared. There was a blank for 50 milliseconds, and then the search display appeared. And since we know, Uri, tell me if I'm wrong, since we know that it takes about 80 milliseconds to make a first full saccade, so we can be pretty sure that any saccade that occurred before 230 milliseconds would be entirely locked to the queue, all right, and could not be influenced by the search display. And so we separated our data between early saccades and late saccades. And what we found is that 27% of first saccades were made to the queue and were locked to the queue, they were early saccades, and 73% of the saccades were late saccades. And when we looked into the early saccades, 95% of the early saccades went to the queue, okay? And if we look at whether there are more early saccades to the target than to non-target, it was completely random, which justifies our assumption that early saccades were uniquely influenced by the queue display. Now, as I said, 27%, is it a lot? Is it a little? It's difficult to say. I can just say in passing that there were huge individual differences. We had like 1 or 2 subjects with 60% of early first saccades, and a bunch of students of subjects who almost did not make early saccades. So I think that an interesting avenue for future research will be to see whether people who fail to take the context into account have other individual characteristics. So that was our first finding, which was a little bit reassuring because 27% when you're completely free to move your eyes is not that much. And then we moved to look at, to see whether we could confirm our other predictions. Now, a very, very strong finding that emerged here in this study, and we looked around and it was replicated in a recent study also by Gaspalin, is that people tend to make an eye movement to the previous target location, which is completely non-predictable, right? It's non-predictive, sorry, of the target location. So if you look here at the percentage of late first saccades to the target, if the target happens to occur at the same location as the previous target, you go there on 70% of the times. And if it appears at the new location, you go there only on 40% of the trial. So it was a very, very strong bias. And this is related to what I talked about earlier about selection history, which is the effects of memory, search memory on attention. So this was a very strong finding, and it actually completely overrode the effect of the cue when the target location repeated. But when the target location did not repeat, you can see that there is a significant cueing effect, which means that I have more chances to go to the target location with my eyes when it benefited from the cue than when it didn't. But if it happened to be at the previous target location, it really does not matter if it was cued or not, because the bias is huge. So in order to see whether our third prediction was confirmed, we looked only at those trials in which the target appeared at the new location. And we looked at whether this cueing effect here was modulated by search difficulty. And what you see here is that when the search was easy, the cue had no effect. When the search was a mixed difficulty, it had some effect, and it had a very large effect when the task was difficult. So whether I moved my eyes to the cue location way after the search display appeared depended on how difficult the competition was. So one thing I just want to mention is that, well, with eye movements, since we're not looking at response times, we can actually have a grasp of where the eyes went, not only of what happened when they went to the target. We can look at when the eyes went to the easy distractor, to the difficult distractors, and so on. I won't describe all these graphs for you, but something that was pervasive in all these results is that the larger the competition was, the more likely the cue was to have an effect, whatever the identity of the item on which my eyes landed. So we got full confirmation of this particular prediction, namely that the cue effect should be larger the larger the competition. Okay. Questions about this study? Sharon, I'm sorry, I don't remember how much time I have. Just,
we're actually sort of flexible. Let's say it's
okay.
about like if you can wrap up in 10 minutes tops, and then
okay, so I'll try to
I have a question, Dominique.
sure.
Was there a difference in the behavior for those participants that had the early saccades compared to the late saccades?
Well, that's of course something very important. We looked at whether we find this gradient of difficulty for the cued location in both types of subjects, and we do. So even when my attention was captured on 60% of the trials by the cue, on the 40 remaining % of the trials, they had the same behavior as the others. Okay?
No, but when it was captured by the cue, was the behavior completely transformed?
What do you mean
I mean,
by the reaction times?
In those cases where the eyes moved immediately to the cue,
yes,
was there a different performance compared to when they moved later on?
Yes, your cue validity effect was larger. Okay.
You would think the other way around, no, Dominique? Because if the eyes move to the cube, which is in the wrong place, you would have a cost for that rather than improvements.
That's what I'm saying. The Q validity effect is larger. So you're suffering more when you have an invalid Q. Okay? So I think I'm going to skip the second study. If I have time, I'll go back to it because the third study actually answers Rafi's question. Okay, so I'll move this one. Okay, so what I showed so far is that we mostly deploy our attention at the appropriate moment. Okay, in the second study, I did not show you, I had direct evidence that I can get Q validity effects even if I have proof sort of that I never went to the Q location. And what's really missing is the role of context. So I'm assuming that you are going to deploy your attention in the search display because the context is telling you to do that, but I didn't show that, okay? And the objective of the third study was to show exactly that. So to do that, we relied on what is called compatibility effects. And these compatibility effects have been reported several times in the spatial queuing paradigm. So suppose that you're looking for this red arrow here, and you have to respond as to whether it points to the left or right, okay? And then you have distractors which also have a direction. So this distractor, for instance, is pointing in the opposite direction. And so it's incompatible with the target direction. And these are neutral in terms of my response, okay? And what people showed is that when a strong Q, like this one here, it's strong because it has the same color as what I'm looking for, and it's also an onset. So when we have a strong Q, we find compatibility effect of the Q distractor with the target. So if the Q distractor happens to be incompatible with the target, I'm going to be much slower than when if it's neutral, for instance. Okay, and the standard explanation is that the Q captured my attention, I remained here, and then I processed everything that's at the Q location, prepared my response, and therefore I was slower when it was incompatible. According to PAF, this happened because this location here has most chances to win the competition. And again, well, the rationale is exactly the same. So with regard to the compatibility of the Q distractor, the standard interpretation and PAF's interpretation make the same prediction. So we needed to introduce a twist in this experiment in order to find a prediction that would differentiate between these two interpretations. And what we did is that we manipulated the compatibility of the Q. So here, this is work that we did with Itai Yaron. And what we have here is that we have a Q, and this Q is made up of arrows that can have the direction of the target, a neutral direction, or an incompatible direction. Okay? And according to the standard interpretation, if I focus my attention here, I'm going to process the direction of the Qs, and I should get Q compatibility effects when they are incompatible relative to where they're compatible. According to PAF, I should only get a compatibility effect with regard to this distractor here, but I should not have compatibility effects with regard to the Q itself. Okay, now since we have arrows in different locations, in different directions in the search display and in the Q display, we could have very complex interactions, which is why we introduce neutral conditions here in order to isolate the effect of the Q and the effect of the Q distractor. So when we're looking at Q compatibility effects, which means I want to know whether I'm going to be faster when the Q has the same direction as the target than when it had a different direction, I'm going to look only at those trials in which the target that appeared at the Q location was neutral. And so it could not interfere with the response preparation. Okay. And conversely, when I'm going to look at the effect of the Q distractor's direction, I'm going to look only at those trials in which the arrows in the Q display were neutral. And so I could disentangle the effects of the Q and the effects of the Q distractor. okay? So as I said, both accounts predict that I'm going to get an effect of the compatibility of the distractor that appears at the Q location. And this is what we find, okay? So this is the reaction time. This is the Q'd item when the Q is neutral, and it can be the target, a neutral distractor, or an incompatible distractor. And we see that we have a Q validity effect, of course, but we also have a very reliable compatibility effect. Okay, so this is not very interesting because both accounts are predicting the same result. What is more interesting is the Q compatibility. And for the Q compatibility, we found no effect whatsoever of the Q. Okay, so far, these results show that with this paradigm, we have evidence that we deploy our attention in the search display and not in the Q display. And we replicated these findings with different stimuli. For instance, here, the arrows in the Q display are more salient than in the search display, and still the results were replicated. And now we come to the question of context. So let's take these examples, and we see that basically subjects can rely on two types of information. They can say, okay, I'm going to wait for the second display to occur, and then I'm going to deploy my attention. Or they can say, okay, I'm going to wait for those thin arrows here, and then I'm going to deploy my attention. So we have information about the displays, the stimuli, and information about temporal order. So this is exactly what Rafi said before. And in the third experiment of this paper, what we try to do is to manipulate the ability of the subjects to rely on context information. So we had three groups of subjects. For one group, the Q were always these arrows, and the search display were always the small and thin arrows. And for another group, of course, it was counterbalanced. This played the role of the search display, and this displays played the role of the queuing display. Okay, for these subjects, we expected to replicate our previous findings, and that is that the search context should be detected easily, and so they should deploy their attention only in the search display, and therefore we should get queued object compatibility effects, but no Q compatibility effects. The third group, which is the most interesting, is a group for which we only instructed subjects to respond to the second display in each trial. And so they could not predict, based on the shape of the arrows, whether they were actually in the search display or the Q display. And so they had no context to rely on except for the temporal display, the temporal context. Obviously, we cannot manipulate both because otherwise subjects would not know what to do, right? If I don't know when the target is going to appear and I don't know what characterizes the display, I don't know what the actual target is going to be. So here, they could rely on temporal information and could not rely on stimulus information. So what we predict here is that they should deploy their attention whenever they detect the task relevant feature, that is the red item. And so in this condition, we predict that we should find Q compatibility effects in the unpredictable context condition, but no Q compatibility effect in the predictable one. Okay? So the less interesting finding, we look at queued compatibility effects in the strong context condition where they could rely on the stimulus, and in the weak context where they could only rely on temporal order. And again, we find a large effect of queued distractor compatibility effect, which means that at some point, my attention was focused at the location of the Q. But as I said before, all accounts predict this finding. The more interesting findings concern, of course, the Q compatibility. And in the strong context, which was basically a replication of the study I showed you before, there was, again, no effect of Q compatibility. But when the context was weak, this effect finally emerged. So you have the compatible condition, neutral, and incompatible. And you can see that on both reaction time and accuracy, now the Q compatibility effect emerges. Okay, so what I showed in this final study is that we don't shift our attention to the highest priority object automatically at any given moment, and we rely on contextual information with a strong role for stimulus information in order to deploy our attention. And also, what triggers the deployment of attention when the context is weak is really the detection of the feature we're looking for. So detecting the feature we're looking for is not enough to trigger our attention if we have contextual information that informs us as to when the appropriate time is. Okay, so to wrap up, what I did here is to ask, according to what rules we update the locus of our attention on a priority map that is dynamic. So what most model implicitly suggests is that whenever the priority changes, I'm going to update the locus of my attention. What we try to suggest here, and of course there's a lot of work to do to confirm these hypotheses, is that we integrate the priorities over an attentional episode, and we take into account the context that is appropriate for the task. And of course, all I showed here is that we know when the accumulation ends, but we don't know when it starts. Does it start at the beginning of the trial? Does it accumulate from previous trials, such as we found when I showed the findings from the previous target location? These are all questions that we still have to investigate. And I think that these results have several implications for attentional research in general. First of all, it shows that our attentional system is maybe more flexible than is currently illustrated by current models. It also shows that we might have to reinterpret previous results because Q validity effects are not necessarily an index of attentional capture. And I think that maybe the most important implication is that the question, does stimulus X automatically capture attention, is basically meaningless. It really depends on the competition, and it depends on the context. And so asking whether angry faces automatically capture our attention cannot have a yes or no answer. What we can say is that, well, an angry face is going to be more likely to capture my attention than a happy face, but there is no stimulus that will always capture our attention in every situation. And it seems obvious to say that, but the number of articles that are written just to answer this question is really large. And so I think we should revise this all or none idea about attentional capture. And I would like to thank my lab members and the ISF. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dominique. I want to invite everybody to unmute themselves, and let's give a big applause to Dominique for wonderful, innovative, conceptual talk, and opening the stage for questions, of course.
אורי? אמרת משהו?
לא, לא ראינו אותך, חשבתי שנעלמת.
אוקיי.
דומיניק, אין כבר השאלה, אני לא...
Uri, please in English.
Okay. I'm not expert in attention, but what is the difference between what used to be called object attention, that draw attention, and what you're describing now?
What used to be what? Object attention?
Yeah, usually in all days you say if you have a silent object, it draw your attention, and then it's take your attention there first. So if you have something that, for example, pop out or more salient or something like this, it's automatically you go there.
Yeah, well, all I'm saying is that you have to take context into account, because it's not like when you have this salient object appearing in your visual field, you're going to automatically go there. Okay, I'm not talking, okay, so just to wrap up, while most models argue about what factors are more important for the allocation of our attention, all I'm saying is that there is another aspect, which is when you deploy your attention. It's not like you're going to have this map that changes all the time and then the locus of attention is going to move from one height, to one peak to the other peak, but you're going to actually have a thicker episode in which you're going to sum all these activations, and only then you're going to deploy your attention. Okay?
Can I make a comment and a linked question? Your experiments are very much structured into episodes. So that there is one trial in which Q happens, and then the test display happens, and then that's when the attention is deployed, and then there's another trial. It's not clear to me whether everyday life in naturalistic situations is actually sort of chopped up in that way, and I just wonder how your model deals with that.
Right.
Perhaps related to that, I wonder how far in your experiment is the actual defined rhythm important? That is, within a given block of trials, the cue happens, and then the target is going to appear some fixed time, whatever it is, 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds later. And I wonder how far what your subjects are doing is sort of setting up a timed response, that they're going to actually use that information in 100 milliseconds time rather than something to do with the appearance of the target display.
Okay, so thanks. It's an excellent question. What I showed in the last study is that time is not enough. Even if the task is really structured and you know exactly when the target display is going to appear, if you don't have stimulus-based information, at least for these time frames that we used, you're not going to be able to apply this contextual temporal information to your task. And you much more rely on stimulus information. We actually had another experiment, which I did not describe, in which we manipulated the temporal context, but the stimulus context still allowed you to differentiate between the search display and the cue display. And I mean, the temporal information did not play any role. I was very surprised because I thought that temporal information would be the most potent in this kind of experiment, but stimulus seems to be much more potent. In everyday life, well, basically, I suppose that you wait for the stimulus context to arrive in order to deploy your attention. So if you're waiting for somebody at the station, you're going to start looking or deploying your attention when the train arrives, right? But you might start by a certain wagon if a big bird had appeared there before, right, at that empty location. So the idea is that you wait for the right stimulus context in order to deploy your attention, because the deployment of our attention is limited. And so maybe we're not just yoked to jumping from one location to the other because it's costly. But as I said, we're going to investigate a little bit more what this attentional episode is actually, how it is actually triggered. What is an attentional episode? When does it start? When is it reset? Is it at all reset? Or does the activation simply wane in time, or wanes by interference because new events have come, and so they weaken previous events?
Can I just ask, if you make the cue dynamic, like flashing or something like that, does that immediately reduce its compatibility with a static target that appears? Or does it make any difference? Because it seems to be that kind of a dynamic stimulus, which is more similar to something we're looking at in everyday life, like somebody speaking, has much more impact on your disengagement which is slower than if a static stimulus.
Okay, so basically these abrupt onsets were something that appears for either 50 or 100 milliseconds and disappear, and sometimes you had two of them, right? And actually, previous research has shown that something that suddenly appears actually captures our attention more potently than a stimulus that was there from the start, but happens to move. So, so again, I think that this kind of manipulation will tell us something about what has a larger weight in the competition. But I'm not sure that it would tell us something about when your attention is allocated. But it is a very interesting question, because we might ask whether something that is more salient is going to, for instance, elicit more early saccades. Okay, so we found that there were huge individual differences in terms of how many people do not rely on the context and just deploy their attention to the object that matches that's the most salient. Perhaps if we made the cue more salient, there would be more early saccades, and this is something that's very interesting to investigate, because it would mean that the context does not tell you only when to deploy your attention, but also the imbalance in the priority maps in time are also going to tell you if you're going to deploy your attention already in the queuing display or later on. So this is something definitely to investigate. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Dominique, how would you relate these fascinating behavioral findings to previous reports on the neural level of increased activation rates across multiple cortical spatial maps in response to the queuing of particular locations long before target array appearance?
Okay, so first of all, something has to calculate the priorities. So you might have priorities that accumulate at different times, and this may be expressed in neural terms, right? And then the deployment of attention could occur when the competition is resolved. So at what is usually called the pre-attentive stage, so you have all these computations, and the question is when you're going to actually make a shift of attention and decide who the winner is. Okay, now I thought you were going in a different direction that is more problematic, and which is the N2PC. So people have shown that there is an N2PC locked to the queuing display when the queuing display matches your attentional set. Now the N2PC has been related to spatial attention, but there's a lot of controversy about what it exactly indexes. So people speak about a shift of attention, others speak about engagement of attention, others speak about the detection of a task relevant object. And so it is not yet clear how we can reconcile those findings from the ERP literature focusing on the N2PC and PAF. Although if the N2PC simply indexes the detection of something that's kept in your working memory, so you're looking for red, and so if something red appears on the screen, this match gives rise to the N2PC. So if this is what is happening, it's not necessarily in contradiction with PAF, but this is really the next step we have to take, and to see how we can relate ERP findings to the PAF predictions.
Dominique, I have a question. Hi. Thanks for the beautiful talk. So you show that, or they even showed before you, that in the easy condition, there's no compatibility or very small compatibility effect, whereas in the difficult condition, the effect is large, right?
You're talking about the validity effect.
Yes, the validity effect. Yes, sorry, the validity effect.
Yep.
And I'm asking myself, how does this work out with the classical finding of Folk and Remington?
Okay. Cool.
That show that, right, if you're like in a singleton mode, So if you, in the easy condition, you had different colors, right?
Right. So yeah. So what happens is that notice that the experiments, the first experiments that I showed you, and also Gaspalin's, used abrupt onsets that are completely unrelated to the target feature, and these give small queuing effects.
Aside from their color.
No, wait.
No, it wasn't a red. Wasn't it a red queue with the red target, or am I wrong?
Wait. Okay. So what we have here is this. So this is this onset queue here. And in easy tasks, they don't find a queuing effect. This is exactly what Folk shows. If you are looking for something red, in this case, it's not, we're not looking for something red, we're looking for a perfect circle, but it's the same principle, right? Something that is absolutely orthogonal to your task is not going to capture attention when the task is easy. And in Folk's paradigm,
yeah, but if you had here, okay, take the all easy.
Yeah.
All easy condition, right? The target here is sort of like a pop out, right? Target. It's very robust relative to its context, right? I think Folk does talk about singleton to singleton. So no matter what's the character, right, that you're searching for.
Sure. Okay. So first of all these were mixed conditions. So you don't know ahead of time whether you're going to have a singleton or not. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that we ran this experiment with a color target, and we manipulated whether the queue matched or did not match the target color. Okay. And what we have is that we replicate our findings with this. Okay. So for the irrelevant queue, we get no effect for all easy, a small effect for mixed difficult, and a large effect for, not large, but an effect for all difficult. And for a relevant color queue, you already find a queuing effect for the all easy condition because the weight of the red queue is larger, but you get the same gradient. So to answer your question, first of all, here we have an irrelevant queue.
Yeah.
And since it's a mixed design that cannot use the single detection mode.
Right. The mixed design solves this question. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Dominique.
Yeah.
There's a way for me to lower my hand. There we go. So it seemed just that you had a lot of dependent variables. You had the mean reaction time, and you had the error rate, and you had the latency of the first saccade, or whether, I guess, that the percentage of first saccades that were short, and the direction, I guess, of the first saccade. And and then you had a whole bunch of different conditions spread out over all of your different studies. And sometimes it seemed like you would focus on one dependent variable, and sometimes you would focus on another, but all of them you seem to say that, well, this is something to do with attention. And I was just wondering if I want to know what attention is doing. And so, you know, if attention is doing something on both the mean reaction time, and it's also doing something on the first saccade, are those two dependent variables correlated across all the different conditions, or?
Okay. Okay. So I can just talk about the things we looked at. So for the eye movement experiment, obviously people who made more saccades, of course, are going to be slower to respond. But what was interesting, for instance, is that subjects who made the largest proportion of early saccades to the queue, on those 40% of the trials in which they didn't go to the queue, they tended to move their attention more. So they had more saccades until they got to the target location. So it means that in their search, the fact that they were inefficient in keeping the context in mind and abiding by it was correlated with how inefficient they were in finding the target. Okay. I'm aware I'm not answering your question spot on, but well, the queuing effect in terms of the queuing effect on eye movement. So people who had a higher proportion, a higher effect of the queue on late saccades were people who had a larger queuing effect on response times. So the queuing effects on eye movements as measured by the percentage of first saccades was correlated with the magnitude of the spatial queuing effect in terms of reaction times. Okay, there are a lot of intervening processes, and this is why these kind of findings is really surprising, because you know, you're going to have many saccades, and when you have many saccades, it should completely dilute the effect of the cue, right? On average, people made 2 to 3 saccades, and people made up to 5 or 6 saccades in order to find the target. And despite this, you still had a very strong effect of the cue and reaction times. And it was correlated with how much the cue influenced your first saccade. So it looks like the real effects are really huge, and then they're diluted by all kinds of additional processes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm okay. So I'd like again, Dominique, we'll stop here because it's already running into
Sorry.
1.5. Thank you for a wonderful talk, and I'll check with you later. I'd like everybody to ask everybody to again thank Dominique for a wonderful talk, and I'll check with you later if it's okay that we upload this to our website.
Sure.
To come down and say goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay. Next week, we'll have Peter Neri with us. Thank you again.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.